Hi, everybody. All right, so you've identified our risks, and a lot of times this will go in a document called a risk register, which gives you a way to keep track of your risks. And once you've identified and documented your risks, the next step is to figure out a value for the risk. When we talk about a value, what we mean is a potential for loss. Does the risk have a high potential to cost us a lot of money? Or could it cause a lot of damage to data that is compromised? And the next thing we're going to do is figure out how to prioritize the risks. We have two types of assessments. The first is a qualitative assessment. It's easy to do. It's based on gut instinct and subjective. It doesn't involve research or gathering data, but it relies on having expertise to make this assessment. It can be an inexpensive and quick way to begin the prioritization process. We use terms like high, medium, or low to describe the probability and impact of the risk. Probability is how likely the risk event is to happen, and impact is the severity of the damage or loss. On the slide, you can see a probability and impact matrix. It's like a heat map, showing that the events in green are low enough probability and impact that we can live with them. The yellow ones are ones that we're concerned about, and for the red ones, we need a very active mitigation strategy, and we should get it implemented very quickly. Based on this type of qualitative assessment, you know which types of risks you need to address first. But if you really want to make a business decision about how much money to spend to mitigate a risk, you wouldn't rely on a qualitative assessment. You'd use that to figure out what to focus on first. But to determine a dollar amount to spend, you'd use quantitative analysis. In other words, you need a dollar value for the potential for loss. That being said, you can't always get a dollar value for a potential for loss. Sometimes potential for loss is hard to measure in dollars. Things like loss of company reputation, customer confidence, or employee satisfaction are all hard to quantify. But for those risk events that you can quantify, you should do so. It allows you to think about the cost of the loss, figure out the cost of a countermeasure, and make a good decision based on cost-benefit analysis. So for quantitative analysis, you need more expertise and you have to do a little math. Now on the exam, for any times that you have to do some math, you will have a calculator. But you need to remember the formulas and the terms we're about to go over. We always start with asset value, AV. What am I protecting and what is it worth? Then we look at the exposure factor, EF. The exposure factor means the impact of the loss. As an example, in the event of malware getting on our server, we'll lose 20% of our data. That 20% is the exposure factor. What we're ultimately looking to come up with is a single loss expectancy, SLE. This means how much money do you lose every time this event materializes. Then the frequency that the event occurs is annual rate of occurrence, ARO. That is tied to probability, how often per year it is likely to materialize. When you take the single loss and multiply it by the frequency per year, you get the annual loss expectancy, ALE. In other words, how much money you will lose per year based on how often this event materializes. Total cost of ownership, TCO, is the cost of implementing a safeguard to include any upfront costs as well as ongoing maintenance costs. Then we have the return on investment, ROI, which is the amount of money you save by implementing the control. It is also referred to as the value of the safeguard or control. Now, it's important to note that the benefit of a safeguard may not always be measured in dollars. Sometimes we implement a control in order to be in compliance with a regulation, and we won't have a dollar amount for that. But the benefit is that we are in compliance. Okay, so these are the formulas. Single loss expectancy equals asset value times exposure factor. As an example, let's say I have a $300,000 warehouse. It catches fire and 70% is lost. So a $300,000 asset multiplied by 0.70 in exposure factor equals a single loss expectancy of $210,000. Okay, so how often does that happen per year? Let's say that happens once every 20 years. So that's 0.05 for the annual rate of occurrence. If the next formula is annual loss of expectancy equals single loss expectancy multiplied by the annual rate of occurrence, that means $210,000 multiplied by 0.05, which equals $10,500. So the annual loss expectancy is $10,500 before you've implemented any controls. Now, we're going to want to compare that to the cost of the control and figure out a positive return on investment. So we have to figure out what the cost of the control is, which is going to be an initial fee plus any sort of yearly fees. So we'll make the example easy and say that the control is a fire suppression system, and the cost of the control is $5,000 per year. If that control were 100% successful, and I went from losing $10,500 a year to losing $0 per year, then a $5,000 per year expense seems like a good investment. But usually our controls are not 100% effective, so we have to determine how much we're losing before we've implemented the control and how much we lose after we implement the control, plus the annual cost of the control to determine the return on investment. So let's say that in our example, the control reduces the exposure factor to 30% instead of 70%. That means the new SLE after control is $300,000 multiplied by 0.30, which equals $90,000. Okay, how much do I lose per year after I mitigate the control? Well, $90,000 multiplied by 0.5 equals $4,500. So the new ALE after control is $4,500. Instead of losing $10,500 per year, I'm losing $4,500 per year. And I'm paying $5,000 per year for the control for a total of $9,500 a year. That means my ROI is $1,000. Okay, so the key takeaways for risk assessments are that it's all about determining a value for risk or your potential for loss. And we can do that with qualitative analysis by looking at probability and impact and using those subjective ideas like low, medium, and high. Or we can determine a dollar value for that loss through quantitative analysis. But remember, not all assets and not all risks can be quantified.